So panelists or audience, it'd be great to just hear at least a few examples of what are people looking at, and maybe a little bit too just about how you're using it and why. Audience or panel.
I want to hear from you.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
I think that was painful, as are all homework assignments at this point in my
Yep.
life.
Yep.
But it was good. And one of the things we talked about was kind of like the, sort of tied to the go-to. And in a rural area, that's a lot different. Like we can't even like pick up at times here, for example. So getting it online has become important. Even on Facebook, just like following the media, the different media. So if they go live or they have breaking news or whatever, that pops up, and then I can choose whether I'm interested in it or not.
Right.
And then we kind of tied that back to the fake news thing, which I just think that's such a misnomer because, if you're going to call it fake news, there's always been fake news. But it's not fake news. It's just that perspective. So for every single thing that comes out, there are 2 or 3 or 4 sides to that story.
Yeah.
So who's to say that, one of them is fake news when they're really just all different perspectives?
I like that, and I think you're right. Any story could be described as fake news. It all depends on the perspective of the person that's doing the talking.
Yeah.
Or the person being written about.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and there's a lot that goes into that. Reputation, rumor, all that fodder plays into the way you perceive it too. So if I hear it and I have background on it, regardless of what that background is, I'm immediately thinking, oh, well, and that leads me to form a conclusion. Not that what I received from the media was slanted, but there's a lot of things that play into that.
Well, I've had that locally. I don't know if you can hear me without the mic or if I need to use it, but
I think for the video, they probably want you to use it.
okay, fair enough. One of the things I've ran into locally is we will write a story and we'll have documentation, we'll have FOIAs, or we'll go to a meeting and we'll cover it, but the people that are being talked about don't like the coverage and will immediately scream fake news to us, and we're littered with documents of what we're reporting. We've had the paper open here for 10 years. We've never been sued for running a story that wasn't accurate. Not that we don't make mistakes. Everyone does. But it's in the last few years, yes, it has gotten worse that, it's fake news, and people trivialize it and tend to ignore it. There's a segment of the population, I think, that just thinks that we make things up.
Yeah.
And, that we can't stay in business making things up. We report things that we find.
Okay, thank you. Can we get just at least a couple more people in to share what local or national media you use and sort of why? And maybe how you're using it too. I didn't ask you if you're using, is local media also online that you're primarily looking? Okay.
Maybe I'll have the morning news on. Here I watch ABC or ABC affiliate, but I typically...
I was going to say shout out to Channel 3 there.
Typically am rushed in the morning, so really it's throughout the day, email, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, sort of. I usually don't go looking for it. It's usually what pops up and gets my attention.
Yeah.
And then I'll dive into it.
That's kind of what we were talking about. You don't even have to sort of look for a lot of national news for sure.
Right.
It's just going to be there whether you want to see it or not. So-
Locally, though, a funny point I was telling Sandra is that, when the Quoin call that we have here went from being a daily to down to fewer days, and then the Quoin weekly came, my initial reaction was, my God, we gotta wait days for news. There's no breaking news or whatever. And now, I get the news I need electronically otherwise, but I'm excited when the weekly comes in my mailbox.
Thank you.
I actually find myself waiting for it, so I know there's not breaking news maybe in there. There might be, if it happened the day before, but, and it's beefier than what I was getting in a daily, if that makes sense.
Yep.
That's a good, lots of nuggets in there that I am looking forward to.
Nice. Okay, anybody else? So can I get just one or two panelists, like go-to for you, local media versus national?
Sure.
I still go to the Southern Illinoisan every day, and I think that it still has value to me, or I wouldn't be paying twice as much for half the news that I used to get. I also listen to WSIU FM for their news in the morning. I think they do an even-handed job, and I think they've got some very professional people. Jennifer Fuller is one of my favorites. And I listen to WJPF radio. I think they do a good job in the morning, too. Tom Miller is he's kind of a local legend and made a real name for himself when he stayed on the air throughout that derecho weather event of 2009. I don't watch that much television, sorry. I do watch it, but when I do watch, I watch Channel 3, and I think they do a good job. And what else? Yeah, WSIU TV, too. So, that's what I do.
Kim, I'm curious what you watch. We were just talking about this in Chicago. What do you look at locally?
Well, we didn't talk about this. I do use a lot of Twitter, so I kind of see everything, but I also go to websites, and I do subscribe to my small city mailbox is bursting every day. But for national stuff, I'll usually go to the New York Times just because, as I mentioned, they're less likely to have news that I think is kind of inconsequential, like more of the kind of cultural, trendy stuff. I mentioned the like coffee cup on Game of Thrones that everybody wrote about after that happened. I didn't really need to know about that. I watched the show. I don't need that on my front page. I would rather find out what's happening, like with selling arms to Saudi Arabia or something for international news. Mm-hmm. And then locally, I listen to WBEZ, which is Chicago Public Media, the public radio station there. And then I guess since this is recorded, I can't say what I read because all my friends will get mad if I don't say their publication.
Fair enough. Well, Kim, maybe I can just get you to hold on. Yeah.
Could we ask the young person in the room?
What? You can ask me.
I want to know where you get your news.
So I would say that I go to WSIL. I watch that sometimes in the mornings, if I'm not too busy. I do for local news. I turn to our own newspaper, the Panelists Press into Quoin Weekly.
Good answer, Christian.
I might get fired if I do that. Yeah, and I said about Facebook too. I do see a lot of things on that, but there's a lot of things that I don't believe on there. I do agree with your perspective thing, but there is a lot of websites that are meant just for clickbait. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with clickbait, but if you just click on a link, there's all kinds of ads on there, and they're just making stuff up so you can click on it so they can make money. So.
Great, thank you. So let's go ahead and then just dig into this topic a little bit. I know that, again, we talked about a lot of different issues yesterday, but I would love to just go through and ask each and one of you just to talk briefly, and maybe just about one sort of thing, maybe one or two, but again, I'm going to ask you to keep it to about 2 minutes, but just in particular, what you feel like is a primary value of local media and why it should be preserved and why it's important.
Here, if I'll go ahead and start. And I'm coming at this from my perspective with the Pinckneyville Press and the Du Quoin Weekly, but since we started the paper, it's been coming up on 10 years here in August, so that we've had the publications. And in that time, we have exposed over $1 million, probably well over that now, but over $1 million of either questionable government spending, corruption, or outright theft just in our local county here in Perry County. And it's one of those things where if we weren't here, this may sound grandiose, but there isn't anyone else covering those things. There's no one else doing those FOIAs and, going after the open meeting violations that we do. Again, I think it exhausts some of our public, some of our readers. I think they think that we get pigeonholed into that. But, there are lots of other things in our publications, but those are the things that we're remembered and known for. Gotcha. And that's one of the things that, we've had, I hate to say this, we've had people that have been arrested and charged with crimes based on stories we've done. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of standing up for the taxpayers. I don't always know if they understand or appreciate that, but I'm proud of what we do.
Well, I think the public needs to have good information about how their tax dollars are being spent. And I think the media does a responsible job of providing that information, and it's a vital service. it's a challenging time with the media landscape changing so rapidly in Southern Illinois. I just made a few notes of things that have happened over the last 10 years. And I noticed that the Daily Egyptian shut down their printing press, and they went from a daily they still call themselves the Daily Egyptian because they have the website, but it's a print product only once a week now. The Mount Vernon Register News went out of business. They closed. That's a paper that started in the 1800s, and at the same time, their paper in McLeansboro also was shut down. The Carbondale Times, Nightlife, and Weekend Times, they were all locally owned. They have since been sold to Paddock Publications, which is just outside of Chicago. Good operation. I'm not knocking them. And they later rolled all three of those publications into one. So it's just the Carbondale Times now. And I don't think that you could say that the combined forces of those papers in one print issue equals what they used to do. It does not. WSIU TV has entered into a partnership with an upstate NPR PBS affiliate, and that I guess they'll get some economies of scale and probably have a greater breadth and depth of coverage out of it, but it's a little too early to tell what's going to happen there. WSIL was sold by local ownership to a bigger group. I think it's called Quincy Media. Am I right on that, Mike? And I haven't seen any changes in their operation, but it's an out-of-town owner. And then, of course, any of you that have been reading the Southern know what's happened there. The staff has been greatly reduced. The amount of news that's printed in the paper is far less. They closed down their office that they used to have in Marion. It used to be in that mall, which is now pretty much closed down itself. And they closed the printing press, and the printing's now being done in St. Louis. And it goes on and on and on. And I don't see the future being particularly bright for small media operations.
Gary, can I ask though, when you're talking about this list of things that closed, in a way, I think the question I'm asking is, why should we care? Like, what's actually lost or gained when that happens?
You're not getting as much information as you used to get, and it's sourced not as well, and it's proofed not as well, if at all. And I think you should be concerned about the quality of the information that you're getting.
Yeah.
Great. I've been here about 15 years, and so when I came here, the Southern was a very robust paper. I mean, it was a good paper to go to, and no fault of anyone's own, just due to cuts of staff, cuts of reporters. It's really not the robust paper that it was. I mean, before you had, the Southern was kind of the regional paper for the area. It was the term, as far as newspaper, even though I'm in television, it was still the one paper I would go and look at. Now I don't really turn to the Southern because, I feel like we're kind of a primary source, but I think there is a lack of reporters out there. I think that's the other big drawback is you don't have as many journalists out there looking into all the shenanigans. And believe me, there's plenty of shenanigans in Southern Illinois. You just got to go look under the right rocks to find it. And I think the president did a great job in that community. But some of these other communities, we try to look at it from my television staff, but there's plenty of more news out there. So I think that's been, why should we care? There's not as many journalists out there looking for the stories and keeping the government's accountable.
Gotcha.
Well, and if I can kind of continue off of what Mike said, one of the things that we're able to do, and I don't think it's as easy for the TV stations because, again, you have limited staff, limited resources, and you're covering a giant geographical area. But one of the things that we're able to do is we can actually dig in on a story and, let's say we file a Freedom of Information request for the story. We've had stories that have taken 11, 12, 13 weeks for us to get that information. And in a TV news cycle, that's almost unheard of. But it's something that we're able to do in print because we can follow the story. And I often joke with government officials, if they would have just done it right to begin with, it's a one and out story. It's done, it's over, we move on, everybody forgets about it the next week. But when they hide something from us or keep it from us, and then we end up getting the Attorney General involved where they have to force them to give us the documents or the video, a dash camera, whatever it might be, it turns it into a much bigger story. And if we're not here doing that, again, no one else is going to. One of the things that I've noticed locally is you have a lot of politicians now that are reaching out directly, and I hate to sit and act like I'm going to be a Trump basher, but with Trump and his Twitter, you have local politicians doing the same thing on their Facebook walls, and they're getting information out to the public before we can get the information out to the public, which is whatever, fine. If you like the clicks and shares that much, go for it. But they're able to control their message, and there's no filter. There's no one asking questions. It's a situation where they can just put out whatever information they want to, and the public is taking that in just like it's factual, whether it is or not.
Gotcha. So I'm hearing accountability. I'm hearing holding institutions and also communities and people themselves accountable. I'm hearing quality of information, like how is that? So are we actually getting good information? And then just stories that aren't being told if you don't actually have people. Kim, you want me to get you in? And then
There's a saying, I don't know how widely known it is, but I've heard it a few times that, the news is what people don't want you to print and everything else is propaganda. I think generally communities are missing something only if the news organizations themselves are doing a good job in meeting the needs of the community first and foremost. And if they are doing that, then what those news organizations should be able to provide is information that helps those local residents make better decisions for their own lives, whatever that looks like for them, whether it's about how they spend their money, where they send their kids to school, what they're going to wear because of the weather today, how they're going to spend their weekend. I think it has to be meeting that need, giving them that good information to help them make better choices. And kind of going off of that, some of those choices can also be increasing empathy. I think that's an important part of the news that, there is a lot of understanding to be had even from, a watchdog investigation that involves, municipal corruption, but something that is, less tied to elections or how your tax dollars are being spent. An example that someone brought to my attention via Twitter the other day, a woman whose grandmother was in a Bible study group and like they do poetry, she wrote a poem about, she read an op-ed that talked about visibility of transgender people, and she has a transgender granddaughter, and she wrote in this poem that she doesn't understand it, but now that she understands enough of this perspective, which came through this news op-ed, she understands how important it is to use this pronoun that her granddaughter is asking for. And that in your own life, that is something that changes the way you interact with your family, in your community. It enhances, yourself and how you interact with the world. And that is a service, too, that through good storytelling, through accurate and very empathetic storytelling, that's something that the news can also deliver when it's not just blood and guts and money.
Well, I agree with everything that you've said. I would add one other part. Community news, local news, we're important because we live in our communities. This is where we live. We know people. We know how things are affecting us, and nobody can tell that story better than we can. And I always like to say, there are big, important national issues, but the real key is, what about here? What's happening here? And I think for the economy, back in those of you who really remember or were hurt in some way or lived through the Great Recession. I mean, that was a big, huge, it was a worldwide story. But what really mattered, I think, in our communities was what was happening to the people in our own hometowns. Foreclosure was a huge problem everywhere. But, we were able to go out and tell the stories of people in our own communities who got into trouble in some way, shape, or form, got a bad loan or whatever. Here recently, I've done a lot of reporting in Granite City. And Granite City, you remember that was on the news because of the steel mill opening up. And so that got a lot of national press. But what wasn't told was the story of that community, what had happened to that community during the recession and how the community had suffered and how much farther the community still has to go now that that steel mill is open. So I think for me, it's also the fact that we live here. This is our home.
I think some of what we've talked about is certainly related to the collapse of print newspapers. And they're not all failing, but at some point, things are going to get financially very untenable for them to continue. And Jeff's paper is a good paper, and it's got a market that's smaller, and it's probably a little bit easier at this point to drill down on the details. Whereas a place like the Southern, it's a big regional operation, trying to cover an awful lot of things, trying to be a lot of things to a lot of people, and they're kind of spread too thin. I don't want to bash my former place. It was a great place to work, and I appreciate Lee Enterprises' ownership. I think they did a good job, but they're facing market pressures that they just can't do anything about. When your revenue declines to the point you can't afford to pay all the people, well, you can't just suddenly generate more revenue. You got to let people go. At a newspaper, you've got two big expenses, people and paper, and there's a limit to how much paper you can get rid of, and there's a limit to how many people you can get rid of before you see the results. And I think what we're seeing is in many markets, and Dean Beckett of the New York Times spoke on this very brilliantly last week. He believes that most local newspapers will collapse within 5 years. I'm not going to repeat that prediction and say I agree with him, but I can see why someone would say that. And maybe what you'll see at the Southern at some point is increased attention to their website, which is pretty vibrant, pretty good job, and maybe they'll go just to a Sunday paper. I don't know.
Well, I wanted to I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to sort of reference, especially for folks who don't know as much about this issue, just a little bit of the history around media consolidation. And so there's an article actually in here that I'm going to read a little bit of in the program on page 6. And it's talking about Waynesville, Missouri, and how their paper, The Daily Guide, was shut down. And it was like a town of 5,200 people. And so it says, they joined more than 14 other cities and towns across the U.S. to lose a newspaper over the past 15 years, according to an Associated Press analysis of data compiled by the University of North Carolina. Blame revenue siphoned by online competition, cost-cutting ownership, a death spiral in quality, sheer disinterest among readers, or reasons peculiar to given locales for that development. While national outlets worry about a president who calls the press an enemy of the people, many Americans no longer have someone watching the city council for them, chronicling the soccer exploits of their children, or reporting on the kindly neighbor who died of cancer. The Daily Guide, which traces to 1962, was a family-owned paper into the 1980s before it was sold to a series of corporate owners that culminated with Gatehouse Media, the nation's largest newspaper company. 5 of the 10 largest newspaper companies are owned by hedge funds or other investors, with several unrelated holdings, and Gatehouse is among them. Critics have said Gatehouse and some other newspaper communities follow a strategy of aggressive cost-cutting without making significant investments in newsrooms. Gatehouse rejects the notion that their motivations are strictly financial, pointing to measures taken in Waynesville and elsewhere to keep the news flowing, said the company's president of U.S. newspaper operations. All newspaper owners faced a brutal reality that calls into question whether it's an economically sustainable model anymore, unless, like the Jeff Bezos-owned Washington Post, the boss is the world's richest man. That's especially true in smaller communities. They're getting eaten away at every level, said Ken Doctor, a news industry analyst at Harvard's Nieman Lab. Newspaper circulation in the U.S. has declined every year for 3 decades. Wow. While advertising revenue has nosedived since 2006, according to the Pew Research Center. Staffing at newspapers large and small has followed that grim trend line. Pew says the number of reporters, editors, photographers, and other newsroom employees in the industry fell by 45% nationwide. So the death of the Daily Guide raises questions not easily answered, the same ones asked at newspapers big and small across the country. Did Gatehouse stop investing because people were less interested in reading the paper? And then to give the thing that at one point they had been producing 3,600 copies of the Daily Guide back in the 1990s, and now Gatehouse is printing 670 copies a day. So, and the other question, or did people lose interest because the lack of investment made it a less satisfying read? So I think the question, and I want to actually ask Mary to start, is that since we're talking about this changing media landscape, Mary told me this really interesting story about sort of the corporate control that you experienced and what that was like initially versus what it became later. And I would just think it would be great if you could just share a little bit of that.
Well, I'm old, so I don't go quite as far back as Hot Type, but we were laughing about that earlier. It's fine. But my point is, my first job out of college, I worked at the Belleville News-Democrat, and that was in 1976. And so we look at corporate ownership these days, and we think about it in a much different way. Back in 1976, the Belleville News-Democrat was already corporate owned. And I think people are surprised by that. But corporations back then were a lot smaller, and they tended to have more of a decentralized approach. So it was actually a Warren Buffett company that owned the Belleville News-Democrat way back then, had bought it from the Hearst family. I'm sorry, that is not correct. I apologize. But anyway, he had bought it from a Belleville family that had owned it for generations. And it was a smaller corporation. It had TV and radio stations that were primarily smaller, in smaller markets. And they owned about 4 newspapers. One was the Kansas City Star, one was the Belleville News-Democrat, there was a paper in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So it was a smaller corporation, but it was a corporation, and it operated like a corporation. But the point was, it was very decentralized in its approach. So all of these little publications operated within their own budgets. They knew their community, they knew their market, they developed their own strategies. I think what we're looking at now are big corporations, and it is not decentralized anymore. And what we're seeing more and more of is, in order to cut overhead, we centralize operations like printing, and the Post-Dispatch, for example, just laid off its entire copy desk, and all of the copy for the newspaper is now being edited out of Muncie, Indiana. It's a Lee Enterprises. Munster, I apologize. Yeah, okay, there you go. But my point being, it's a different kind of corporation now than what we saw then. And hedge funds are a lot different in terms of what they're looking for. Back in the early days of this, there was some positives to it. We could share resources and knowledge if we had kind of a network that we could develop with our organizations. And I think at some point that switched and it became very different. So I think what we've seen now is 4 decades of corporations buying up small family-owned papers, family-owned radio, TV stations, and it's just a different operation now.
I'd kind of like to piggyback on what Mary said, and my experiences were similar to what you described with smaller ownership. When I started with Lee Enterprises, it was a comparatively small chain operation. And I worked for the Racine Journal-Times up in Wisconsin, and we weren't controlled quite so tightly by financial pressures. What you've seen happen with Lee, in large part, is responsible because it happened for a couple of reasons. People are looking at these things to get their news now, not at print papers. Get on a commuter train sometime and see what people do. They're looking at their phones. And the other thing is, with the collapse of the advertising revenue, they have to make some changes. Lee, on top of all that, got really large early in the 2000s. They bought the Howard newspapers in, I think, 2000, or 2002, actually, sorry. And they bought the Pulitzer newspapers in, I believe, 2005. They paid $1.46 billion for the Pulitzer papers and went heavily into debt. They still owe nearly $500 million. There's a question as to whether they could, if they sold all of their operations, would they get that? I don't know. Basically, what you've got is corporations that own media are controlled by their bankers, and I think that hurts all of us.
Yeah, if you don't mind me kind of chiming in on that, I went through the changes at the Belleville News Democrat that you were referring to. It was Capital City ABC, and they were a wonderful company to work for. And then Disney bought us, and when they realized that we were part of what they bought, they immediately sold us to a company called Knight Ridder. And a few years in, Knight Ridder did a 20% FTE, full-time equivalency reduction, and it really didn't affect us deeply. There were a lot of people that were hanging on till retirement. They were able to get early buyouts, go enjoy their lives. It didn't hurt. The next year, it worked so well, it was 13, 15 months later, they decided, let's do it again. And at that point, it cut to the bone. And I don't think that operation or operations that have done that have ever been able to recover from that. One thing that we run into locally, we had a website that we had up for a while, and we were populating it, but we noticed a drop in our newspaper sales on the racks. And it didn't take me long to realize that, even in our small community, people are going to get it free or they're going to buy the paper, but they're probably not going to do both. And we actually have doubled down on print, and it's working very well for us. I wish there was some wood to knock on close. I'll get Gary here. But it's worked very well for us. We actually had our best year that we've ever had last year, from a circulation and from an advertising standpoint. Now, do I think that 5-10 years from now we may not have to switch to some sort of digital model? Possibly, but right now print is what works and what pays the bills for us.
I wonder if you could talk about your resistance to go.
Yeah. Oh, what was that?
I wonder if you could talk about your resistance, and I say resistance because we're all struggling with this new digital world.
Yeah.
The one big change you'll see at our station is a lot more digital content. Really, for us, it's more important. Broadcast is still our big thing. I'm speaking as our general manager, so he'll be one driving our revenue for us. But our broadcast is still our moneymaker. But for us, digital is, it may make some nickels and dimes.
Yeah.
But we look at it as more as a promotional tool. From a newspaper point of view, is that not the case, or do you feel like we're giving away too much?
The thing that we run into in our market, and I don't know which microphone that was, so I apologize if I deafened everyone in the room if that was me. I think I may be getting it too close to the monitor. The thing that we ran into is we are such a small market that online you are never going to be able to get enough click-throughs. You're not going to be able to get enough page views in a market like ours to be able to sell advertising at any sort of rate that would keep the doors open. The employees, which I have several of here in the room, and thank you guys for coming, but to keep them paid and to keep the business in operation. And what we have found is that if we stick with the print, we're able to sell our advertising. We're able to sell subscriptions. We're able to sell newspapers on the stands. We had a issue that came out this past week, and we have a graduation section in that issue, and we've had a lot of people that have been buying that for the graduation section. It doesn't hurt that our competitor, I won't name them, but only printed the high schools and didn't do any of the junior high graduations this year. So, it's one more niche that we have, one more thing that we're doing in the community that other people aren't, and you're simply not getting it anywhere else.
Can I just ask you, what is the age, the demographics of the subscribers that you're referring to?
Okay, so it's funny you say that because there is the national trend that newspaper subscribers are older. And yes, we have our share of, an older demographic at the newspaper. My partner, Jerry Reppert, that owns the Anna newspaper and several others that he's partnered with in Southern Illinois, was at a track meet a few weeks back in Anna. And he saw some kids there from Pinckneyville. He decided to go over and take some pictures for us, which was very nice. We love sharing content like that. And he walked over to the kids, talked to them, took their picture, mentioned the paper, and all of the kids that he interacted with talked about reading the newspaper. And it's one of those things that we have made a concerted effort to put news in that is relevant to those younger readers. Now, they're going to go off to college, they're going to do their thing. But when they come back to the community, and hopefully they do, because Southern Illinois has a tremendous amount of brain drain, and we need to do something to stop that. But bringing those kids back locally and having them work here in the community, the hope is that they circle back to us at some point, and that has been proving out. We've got a lot of younger parents. When they get kids into the schools and we're covering the things that are of interest to them and about their kids, we pick those people up, and we normally keep them through the high school years. They may drop off for a while, they may not, they may come back, they may not come back, but the numbers have been relatively steady for 10 years, and we haven't had the giant decreases in circulation that you're seeing nationwide.
And I also would love, Gary, I'll get you in, then I want to ask
Yeah,
Kim
just
a
let
question.
me say something quickly. I want to commend Jeff and his people for the job that they're doing, and the future might look a little brighter for hyper-local operations like that. And I think that you're smart, concentrated on faces and names. That's what people want. Those kids want those pictures for scrapbooks. They want them for grandma. And there will always be a market for that. I shouldn't say always, but I see a long-time market for that type of thing. With your operation, one thing that I would be concerned about is the $15 minimum wage that's coming up, and I'm wondering how you're going to be able to afford that and where the money's going to come from.
Well, I'm going to hold that
I want to
question.
circle back to that.
Okay, you can circle back to that. But because I want us to, as we're talking about this corporate model, we're talking about local models, I also want to push on what other models are out there and what other things, so that we're not only talking about people as subscribers so I want to, Kim, just go to this question of City Bureau, maybe talk a little bit about what City Bureau does, but in particular, the point you were making about when you see residents as partners and collaborators. I mean, talk a little bit about that.
So I'm going to get to that point in maybe hopefully 2 steps. One thing people in the room might already be aware of this, but generally the struggle that's happening, at least with print, the model used to be print was very valuable to sell ads, digital that became a little less valuable. Then you have Facebook and Google coming along. They have much better ad targeting. They can target people, by education level, by geography. That's way better than even your local news can do. So they vacuum up virtually all of the digital advertising dollars. There's little left for publications that are online, and Facebook and Google also don't have to pay publishers anything to use that content, because the publishers put that content on Facebook and on Google themselves. Apple News is trying to do something where they're trying to do kind of a revenue sharing thing. I don't know how that's going to work out. So that's kind of the trouble with the model and why digital is struggling so hard. As far as nonprofit news, City Bureau is one of the outlets. We're lucky because we are in, a major market. We're in the 3rd largest city. It's mostly foundational support. McCormick Foundation, Sanders Foundation, the big guys. Depending on the size, if there is maybe a mid-sized community, there is, the Pritzker, the Rockefeller type of family in every community. Is that a source you could go to maybe look for some, endowment money, something like that? Something as far as partners, though, well, I guess the other quick things I would want to add is, and I'll get to the partnership part, some things that digital outlets are doing, I think you'll see this with New York Magazine is one example, Huffington Post is one example, where they do affiliate marketing. So they might do a kind of servicey package of, the 10 best coolers to bring to the state fair, and they'll have links to online sales. The publisher will get a share of that revenue if the reader buys from that. That's one way. There's been, I can't remember where it was, but there was a small paper that made a really, really great escape room. Those, I don't know how to describe escape room, but if you're familiar with that concept, it was kind of like a fun, adventure activity, team activity, and they run one, and that is a revenue stream for the paper, and it's been really successful. getting to the community.
That's how you're going to pay for it.
Yeah, an escape room. Yeah, escape room, or even publishing special editions, graduation things. The Chicago Tribune still got a good amount of money by publishing or printing other people's papers. Print, as that maybe dwindles, they'll have to reevaluate that. Kind of segueing into the community part, there was a really popular podcast called In the Dark by American Public Media, which I think is based in Minnesota. The first season was about the Jacob Wetterling case, and that was essentially the case that prompted the creation of the Missing and Exploited Children's Registry. And that case, talking to people about that, everybody in Minnesota, they know that case, even though it happened in this one small town. And so season 2 is covering a man who's possibly wrongly on death row, named Curtis Flowers. It became a phenomenon like some of these true crime podcasts. And so what APM did for this specific podcasts in a sense are like verticals of, newspapers. They're kind of under the ownership of the the podcast or the radio station operator, but they're kind of their own, company or their own publication. And they did a premium private Facebook group subscription where you'd pay $50, you would get some information, and you would also get an invitation to a private invitation-only Facebook group where you would get additional information about the case. You could ask questions of the reporters and of the creators, and it dictated how some of the follow-up was. You would get discount codes when they did tours and did kind of like live panels and things like that. And so it really tapped into the captive audience that they had. For partnerships, there is a hyperlocal news outlet called Block Club Chicago, which is doing, Chicago is sometimes called a city of neighborhoods, where every neighborhood is essentially a small town, and Block Club is covering the city on the neighborhood level, block by block. And they are mostly driven by subscribers. They have some other models with blockchain, which I won't even pretend to understand. City Bureau has nonprofit support. Again, we're in a unique situation because we're in a big market and we can kind of pull that attention from these big donors. But something else that City Bureau does as far as our model is we pay everybody who participates. We have 3 aspects of our program. One is a public newsroom, which is kind of a forum like this. One is the fellowship program where we train younger journalists, mostly journalists of color from the South and West sides, who are outside of the kind of elite pool, very white, very privileged pool that you see in journalism right now. And then the third aspect is the documenters program, where people are also trained to document anything that's eligible under the Open Meetings Act, whether that's a city council finance meeting, whether it's a local school council meeting, and they will sometimes live tweet it, they write a report, and that goes into a database, and anybody can use that. And so the partnership aspect of that is not even the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times or NBC5 has the budget or the manpower to put people at every one of those meetings. We don't expect that the documenters, as they're trained, are journalists. They're not surfacing stories that come out of the meetings, but they are there and they are a presence, and that goes into a database so any citizen can look and see, well, what did my local zoning committee decide at that meeting I couldn't attend? Or other journalists can look at that and try and write stories that are more, I think, kind of ahead of the ball. They're not as reactive. They're a little more proactive. And something that I think is really important about that is, at least in City Bureau's philosophy, we don't believe that journalists are the heroes. We help people get information, and the people can help change things. We will write something about what the mayor's office did. Journalists can file the FOIAs and get the dash cam footage of the Chicago police shooting Laquan McDonald. It's all of the young organizers who demanded the resignation of Rahm Emanuel and who took over the streets on Black Friday, who demonstrated, who took over City Hall. They were the ones that put the pressure on the public officials. That the journalists helped them amplify the info, and they also worked with the community to get that info. So I think ultimately the partnership comes in. The journalists can help sort of spark that, but ultimately it's the community that's going to not vote for someone again if they don't do a good job.
Tell everyone in the room, because they may not be familiar with that case. Laquan McDonald.
Oh yeah. So this will maybe get into some other issues of like representation and equity in storytelling later on. But so in 2015, there was a black teenager who was shot on the southwest side of the city in Chicago, at least as no shade on the major metro dailies or the radio stations or the broadcast, but these stories are presented as something that's somewhat typical in Chicago. And everybody reported it as just another shooting, a police-involved shooting, and most of the information came from the police. They say, he was acting aggressively, the police were threatened, they opened fire, they feared for their lives, he died at the scene, we called for aid. And then a few months later, an independent journalist got word that, you should see this kid's autopsy report. He had 16 shots all over his body. Does anybody need to be shot 16 times? They try and request the dash cam video of the incident. All sorts of problems. There's no sound on it. The batteries were put in backwards in the camera. After it took more than a year, and it took a lawsuit to pry that footage loose from the city. And part of that matters because the working theory is that the mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, wanted to suppress that video so that he could survive a difficult re-election. And after his re-election, he's safely in office. Okay, I guess we'll have to let this video out. And it, I think it was a real moment of reckoning for the media in Chicago because there were a lot of black residents who immediately said there's something not right about this, and everybody reported it just exactly as the police told them. Mm-hmm. And that caused, that was just a perfect example of the mistrust that, these communities had with their local media. And they were right because we all got the story wrong. And it took a long time and a lot of work until we even got close to getting it right. And, maybe if there had been more reporters from the neighborhoods where these stories were circulating, where this, this young man was from, we would hear that, this happens more than the stories that eventually make the headlines. This is something that is really a pattern in practice. And then the U.S. Department of Justice comes in and investigates, and they find it is a pattern in practice. There were people in Chicago who knew that story years before any of the journalists did. And that was our fault. That was our failing for not really being there to listen, not including them, and not doing a good enough job of earning their trust.
Yeah. If you don't mind me saying this, tell them what the video actually showed.
Oh, so I'm sorry, I'm doing such a bad job of actually telling this story as a journalist, as someone who covered this story. So the very typical, I actually cover police, that's one of my beats, and one of the very typical things, it's encoded in case law where police are pretty much off the hook if they can say, I discharged my weapon, I feared for my life. That's something that as sworn officers, they are empowered to do. And the officer said that this 17-year-old was wielding a knife, charged at officers. He was jumping on cars, and he lunged at officers with the knife, and so they had to shoot him. What the videotape showed is that there was only one officer of the, I think, 6 squad cars that responded. One officer was on the scene for fewer than 20 seconds when he opened fire, and the videotape shows Laquan McDonald walking away from the police, and he shoots him. The first shot spins him around, takes a few more shots, he's on the ground. And the video, it's horrifying because he's on the ground and you still see puffs of smoke coming up from his body because he, is continued to be shot by this officer. So many questions in that. And without that video, the community was ready to believe that something wasn't right. And there was a lot of people that, they needed to see the video, and that's, kind of a problem too. But there is a larger problem that some of it is because there's, a lack of resources and time, just, getting breaking news out. We do rely on the police. We probably rely on police too much, but we do rely on police for the official crime report to say, this was the address, this was the, the suspect, but it just happened. CPD have, killed 10 people in the past month, and I would probably wager a guess that not all of those situations would be completely justified if you had full audio and video. But these are hard stories to tell, and kind of what you were dealing with as far as people saying there's a lot of people who don't like the fact that we say Chicago police, you should do a better job, because they say, why do you hate the police so much? Why is everybody anti-law enforcement? And we're not anti-law enforcement. We're anti-bad law enforcement.
Can I ask just a question about working with community and what that looks like to do it well? Because clearly, when you're telling this story, which is a devastating story for all of us who know about it, but that the local residents did know.
Yeah.
And so if people had been talking to them, listening to them, if they were the voices you've been hearing, then that would have been a different story. And so I guess one of the questions I have is like, what are the effective strategies for learning the needs and interests of the actual community, and then trying to meet those needs? I guess the question of like, how is that changing? And I'm thinking about this because when we did this recent conversation, and Molly Parker was here, who's the Southern Illinoisan, and she had done this big Propublica story on affordable housing. And so she told about how she went to this community, did this story about affordable housing that the residents themselves who were victims of it were very glad there was somebody there to tell the story. A lot of the other people in the community felt like you're coming and telling this bad story about our community, and were upset about it. And so she was describing how later they came back after the story went out and they did a listening tour to hear the community. And my question to her was like, why isn't the listening tour before you write the actual story? And so it was just I guess that's the question I have of like, when we talk about community and we talk about the decline of circulation, all these things, well, what are the community's needs? How do you find them out about them? And how do you know if you're meeting them?
I mean, one quick thing I would say is something that a lot of newsrooms, because news organizations still aren't representative of the communities they report on, they need to recognize that, they have to correct that, and that doesn't mean just hiring entry-level reporters. That means, management, editors, the whole thing. It's also recognizing when the person you have is not the right person to tell that story. I don't think that I would be the best person to go into, a predominantly black neighborhood and try and understand the perspectives of, what young black women are dealing with when it comes to being stopped by the police. There's probably a better reporter for that. Not that I wouldn't, try and do a good job and be empathetic. If I am the person that does that, then I have to do my research. I have to be humble about what I don't know, and I have to approach the community not through a deficit lens. I'm not talking to them because they're so poor and wretched and unlucky. I'm talking to them because they're people, they're our neighbors, they are taxpayers, they are humans, and their stories, they deserve the full dignity and the full kind of accurate storytelling that, we give to, the fact that Laquan McDonald was talked about in his record as like a troubled youth, and people made a big deal of how old he looked for his age, and how big he was and how scary that must have seemed. You don't see white children talked about that way, and that's something these are always things that we have to be sensitive to, especially if we are not of those communities. We have to realize how we might be harming those communities with some of the practices we've been engaging in.
It's a tragic, horrible story, and I think lack of sensitivity is a factor in it. But the thing that I talked about earlier, I think lack of resources has something to do with that. Even a place as big as the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times, they don't have the numbers of people that they used to assign to neighborhoods. When I worked for a medium-sized paper up in Wisconsin, every reporter on the staff had a neighborhood that they were connected with. And something like that, I can't imagine happening in Racine. We would have known the Fuhrer. We had sources everywhere. And we weren't the best possible paper, but we did a pretty darn good job. And I think it's a lot easier to do that good job if you got enough people.
Well, when we talk about getting community involved, I think I worked for small newspapers, and then I worked for a large newspaper, and now I work for public radio. And one of the things that I think I've seen, and it changes, and it's different depending on where you're located geographically and what type of news organization you are. But we've always tried to involve our audience. And sometimes it's so simple as we have a feature called Curious Lewis. And we invite people to send us questions. Are you curious about something? Send us a question. In Chicago, they have one, yes. A lot of the public radio stations are doing that. There's Curious George, I think, somewhere. But and so people will send us questions. And sometimes they're lighthearted questions. You know, why does that street end where it ends? Are there deer in Forest Park? I had to answer that one. Just fun questions sometimes. What happens to the baseballs at Busch Stadium when the umpires throw them out? You know, they're throwing balls out all game long. What happens to those baseballs? So some of them are fun questions, but some of them are questions that we have to delve deeper. For example, there's been a lot of discussion about merging between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We were getting a lot of questions from people about that merger. And they aren't necessarily questions that we might have had as reporters or as journalists, but they were very good questions, and they began to make us think about other directions, about other stories that we could tell. We've also tried to do some outreach with our community to invite them in a little bit. We just had a mini journalism program where for 6 weeks we had a discussion group 2 nights a week for I think it was 6 weeks. I apologize, 6 sessions for 3 weeks. But anyway, we invited people, and we had about 100 people come, and we talked about journalism. We talked about how we interview people, how we research stories, how we produce a newscast. But we also talked about questions about ethics and questions about fake news, and is it fake news or is it opinion? And I think that was very helpful. I think personally it varies. If you're a small newspaper here in Southern Illinois, you're going to approach that differently than if you're a public radio station in St. Louis. But I think the key is that we all need to be more aware of the fact that we don't know everything, and we don't have enough people to, you know, go out and keep all of the different corners of our communities covered. So we need to rely more on our communities.
I kind of wanted to underscore too, I guess, as like sort of the representative city mouse of the group. A lot of why I bring up the south and west sides is because I think they have more in common with rural areas in Southern Illinois as far as the access that the community has to resources, the kind of native coverage that it has. So, you know, kind of like everybody said, there's a lot more in common. I mean, in a big city especially, who runs big cities? It's the wealthy people. So there are always going to be people in cities who are not, that have somewhat, you know, a lot more in common with communities that are, you know, not as metro, not as affluent. But something that I also wanted to mention, I know that there's a lot of news people in the audience. I don't know if there is anybody not a news person or comes from, you know, like a newsroom background. Okay. So yeah. Well, I don't know what this looks like, you know, in communities that I would assume to be more close-knit because of the size, but I always wonder, regardless the size of your city, how many local residents know a journalist? If they have a question or if they want to give them a tip, if they want to engage with them, how easy is that? Because, you know, anybody who's ever read like the letters to the editor that come in, you know, or like the tips inbox, they're not always great. Sometimes they are great. I've never got a great one. But I think, you know, like on my block, I try and let every one of my neighbors know in a not too obnoxious way. It's like, I'm a reporter. If you ever hear anything, like tell me. And I hear things like, you know, they're not always things that would maybe be headline news, but it gives me a context and it gives me a grounding. And so I think that is a question I always wonder, how can outlets do a better job being available to the communities? Because the other thing too is, as the media market gets more fragmented and, you know, sometimes reporters become more kind of brands unto themselves, you know, I think that reporters always should like be of the people, you know, be really approachable. So hopefully if you are not a journalist, you know one, or you feel like you could get a hold of one and get a response. You would have their email, you could, you know, send them a message somehow and get a response.
Yeah.
If I can kind of follow up on that, when I first started the newspaper, and it was after the big corporate-owned newspaper that was in Pinckneyville, you know, crashed and burned. I mean, I hate to say it that way. It's exactly what happened. And, you know, we opened the paper about 3 months after the other paper had gone, and the town had gone without a paper for a while, and we were really embraced and welcomed. And kind of what you were saying there about how that is different in a small community. In the beginning, especially, I was viewed as the newspaper. We had a staff of 3 people. We had a receptionist, we had an editor, and myself. And as we grew over time, we added, Jessica worked for us for a while. Stephanie has been just a pillar for the paper. Christian, we've got our editor, Pete Spittler, and other people that have come to work for us. And our operation has grown and expanded. And we still don't have enough people to cover everything. It's, but the realities of the financial situation for a paper our size are what they are, but we do as best we can. What I've ran into is people would come up to me and they say, "Oh, we didn't see you at this event. We didn't see you at graduation. We didn't see you at, whatever the event might be." And I said, "Well, Stephanie was there or Pete was there." And they're like, "Yeah, but you weren't there." And it's one of those situations where in some ways people almost made too much of a connection with me with the paper. And I think that has waned over time as they've gotten used to everyone else being there. But in the beginning, like I said, I was the newspaper in town. And trust me, once we started covering, various things that were going on in the community that, like you said, everything else is PR, we started covering the things that people didn't want covered. You wouldn't believe the amount of news tips that people walk in the front door. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" Or they call, or the office gets a call and they send me a number in a text that, "Hey, you need to call so-and-so." Most of the time I don't know these people, but they know me from opening the newspaper. So, they know the number at the office, and then they'll text it to me, but my number's out there and readily available. I mean, trust me, I get the calls I don't want to get to from people from time to time because not everybody's always happy with our coverage. But we do try to be open and honest and fair about what we do. So that, that kind of what you were talking about there kind of spoke to me there. And, in the beginning, our operation has evolved over time to be a larger operation. And, there was a time when I laid out every page of the newspaper. I don't know when the last time that was. And it's because we've been able to, we've been very lucky and been able to get good staff that has come on and they care about our community.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a couple of things you said in there I'm struck by was just one, the need to have personal relationships and the fact that people want to see you at these actual events, but also that it sounds like when you made the real line in the sand, we're going to be filing these requests, we're going to actually be going, that people took that seriously, that there was credibility at least, even if people don't all like it. After
our initial story that we did that really took us down that path was I had a business owner come to me and they said, there's a lady here in town and her son was died 7 years ago. The police have told her it's a suicide, but they won't give her any information. They won't let her look at the file. They won't tell her anything about what happened to her son. And we reached out. I thought, this doesn't quite sound right. So we reached out to the sheriff's department. And at first they're like, you're talking about the suicide. And I said, yeah. And they said, we'll have the investigator call you. 3 weeks go by, there's no call. I call back. Hey, I forgot to have him call you. We'll have him call you. This was several years ago and a different sheriff than we have now. And another 2 weeks go by, I call back, and I'm told at that point, we're not going to talk to you. So I file a FOIA for it. I get a denial for any information in it. They actually said in their denial that it was an open and active case. I filed an appeal to the Attorney General, and at that point, the county actually came back to us and said, okay, we'll show you the stuff, but you can't make any copies or take any of the documents. And I said, well, that wasn't the point of this. The point of this was for the mom to be able to see the information. I said she has to come with me. And at first they balked against that and finally acquiesced and let her come in. They hadn't touched the case since 2 months after the young man was found shot. And to this day, it is still an open suicide. There are a lot of questions that revolve around it. But that was the first story that we printed in the paper that really kind of set the tone for what we were going to do. And I just was in a situation where if I was that mom, I would want to know what happened to my child. And up until that point, she had not been able to see one piece of documentation from our sheriff's office.
Wow.
And like I said, after that story, the floodgates kind of opened up because people realized, oh wait, they'll talk about these things, they'll cover these things, they'll research them, and we do.
Great, thank you.
Exactly.
So I want to come back in a minute when we close out to a little bit about looking to the future and sort of what your vision is or thoughts on like what we need more of, what we need less of. But I first just want to ask the folks in the audience if you had additional questions just on any of the stuff we've already talked about that you might want to follow up on, or comments yourself about your own experience.
The shyest group of journalists I've ever seen.
As I'm a student in the 70s and as just going out, the DE was like every morning, everybody running, everybody came out and had coffee, and it was like a camaraderie thing. And lately, I mean, personally, I think newspapers, to me, that's a big loss to us.
I certainly agree, and that's been my experience. I'm a little different than everyone else on the panel in that I'm not working for any media outlet at this point, but it's such a challenging time, and looking into the future, I'd like to be a little more optimistic, but here in Southern Illinois, it's going to be very difficult. If there is a foundation that's very well heeled that would love to run a newspaper, I'm unaware of it, and I think I would be aware of it if it did exist. What could happen, I suppose, but it would all depend on the willingness of a corporation to sell something, and they're not going to sell it unless they make a buck on it. A wealthy benefactor, that would be one possibility. If you had a Warren Buffett type person who wanted to take over the operation at a newspaper, they could make it work, and that would be a great opportunity, but I'm not sure I see that happening at any point down the road. And some of it's so difficult because newspapers in particular rely on advertising for their revenue, and you'd like to criticize business owners for not buying more print ads, but how could you really do that? They've got a static advertising budget, and they need to get their message out to as many people as they can. And how many are you really going to reach with one expensive print ad? You need to have advertising dollars spread through online, to radio, to TV, maybe to some entity that uses phones a lot. So that's a lot of hands out there looking for the same amount of dollars that you used to have. So it's a very challenging time.
And can I just ask Gary, just in that sense, when you and I were talking on the phone, one of the things that you were sharing with me is about teaching journalism students was because you couldn't really predict for them what are they walking into, or what will they be walking into. You were referring to it as sort of like they need to be sort of Swiss Army knife people, which I'm assuming like a jack of all trades in some way.
Yeah, and the reason is right now, and this is the irony, journalism is so challenged, and maybe we need it more now than we ever have. And there are still people who want to be journalists, but I'm not going to walk into a classroom at SIU Carbondale and train them exclusively to be print reporters. It's crazy. Anybody that wants to be a journalist needs a variety of skills, and that's where that Swiss Army knife thing comes from. They need to be able to write. They need to be able to shoot photos. They need to be able to shoot videos. They need to be able to produce videos. They might have to be able to put together graphic arts displays. They might be able to assemble searchable databases, which is a real growth opportunity. They should be proficient at social media and maybe at podcasts. So that's a lot of skills. They can't be terrific at every one of them, but if you could be terrific at two of them and good enough to get by at the others, you'll have a future somewhere. Good reporters are always going to be needed.
Yeah, Matt.
A related question?
Yeah.
The Champaign News Gazette organization, interestingly, is a nonprofit organization. They're actually operated by a nonprofit foundation, and they own not only the Champaign News Gazette itself, but quite a few small town newspapers, rural newspapers in surrounding counties. And I tried really hard to find someone from that organization or from one of the smaller papers owned by it to join us this evening. Just couldn't make it work. But I'm really curious about that. Does anyone know how well that model is working, and especially how those smaller newspapers fit into that model, and how is it working for them, or do you know of similar models anywhere?
I'll go ahead and say this: there are a lot of times that we function as a nonprofit, although we need to be. So that does happen. But the thing that worries me, and we talked about having a benefactor or someone to come in with a foundation. The thing that worries me, especially in a town of our size, anyone who is going to have the wherewithal to be able to do that is probably going to have strings attached as well to the coverage that we do.
Bingo.
And that's a situation where it worries me ethically to have someone like that could have that kind of control over you and your news organization.
I wrote an op-ed about this in the Times. Like last year, there was a very nationally famous, but from Chicago, hip hop artist who bought a hyperlocal publication in Chicago, and I wrote about how that's probably not a good idea because he also didn't have a great track record of being friendly to the media when they published things that were even lightly critical. So if that's how he is with his own press, how is he going to be if he's the owner of one? So yeah, I mean, I think in general, I think a lot of reporters, as they're facing layoffs, will ruefully joke of hoping for the Jeff Bezos fairy godfather, which is neither realistic nor probably really a solution. I mean, I don't think that there are heroes like money will help, but I don't have an answer for it, but a discussion that I hear a lot is, should news be free? And, I am someone who does get frustrated when I see people on Facebook saying, can somebody copy and paste the article? I ran out of free ones. But on the other hand, if this, so that makes me mad as someone who tries to make a living in this field. But also, I don't think that news should be limited only to the people who are able to afford it. And if we want everybody to be informed and have access to this information that can help them make better decisions about their lives, we have to decide, does a model look like, pay what you can? So some people will subsidize those who pay little or nothing, and maybe nonprofit news, whether in, kind of design or just in reality, if that is going to be more of a future. I definitely think, corporate, shareholders, they're always going to want a return on their dollar. And so news organizations are just less and less able to deliver on that. So maybe things will kind of naturally go that way. But I do think partnerships are going to be one way that things work in the future. Propublica, which is an investigative nonprofit that's based out of New York City. They have Propublica Illinois, which is based in Chicago. They really want everybody to know that they want to be here for you. They want to be here for all of Illinois, not just Chicago, even though that's where most of the reporters are located and most of the coverage has happened. They have a local reporting network where they pay Molly Parker from So for example, their local reporting network is they pay $75,000 for that reporter's salary. They remain on staff, and then they also get support for their investigative work from Propublica, whether that's audience engagement, data analysis, design and things like that. And that's one way to do partnerships. But Louise Kiernan, who's the editor-in-chief, and she says hello to everybody. One thing that she said is a struggle is that two of the partner organizations that Propublica National has partnered with have gone bankrupt or closed in the process of this. There was one I don't remember which outlet, but they published an investigation and they were all out of business the next day. So there is, they're able to work with outlets that are kind of in a mid-size, but for the towns that have 4,000 people and still need news. I don't have an answer for that, so we'll have to keep thinking on that.
Yeah, and we have about 5 minutes left, so I want to close this out. So I want to really just pick up on Kim's point about the importance of, look, what is something we're going to need in the future? It sounds like partnerships is one, those kinds of things. So I want to ask that similar question of all of you. Something promising or that we feel like in the future we need to have or is going to need to be there.
One thing that I see coming down the pike here in the future, in the very near future, and it goes back to Gary's question about the $15 an hour minimum wage. If anything is going to close our news organization over the next few years, it will be the $15 an hour minimum wage. Not only because it's going to affect us, but it's going to affect the businesses that advertise with us. It's going to affect the readers that possibly get laid off at those businesses. You know, I'll go political here for a second. $15 an hour minimum wage may work in Chicago. I don't see how it's going to work in Southern Illinois.
Would it help more people buy papers?
The problem that you run into, I can name one business development right now that would have employed a lot of people, and 2 other businesses, and this is in the Metro East area, that have shut down their projects because it's coming. And how many of those are happening that we don't know about? Southern Illinois, everybody in the room can tell you it needs every dollar for our economy that we can get. And I'm afraid it's going to run a lot of people into Missouri and Kentucky and Indiana in our area.
So,
If you look around the room, you can see heads nodding.
So, Jeff, what would you suggest, though? Like, in the face of that, what do you think is needed? Because in a weird way, it feels like if that's where we're trying to take off, we're trying to get the slack.
Yeah.
That seems a little strange to me.
I did the math on this, and it is going to, in the first year, practically double the cost of my subscription to be able to handle the minimum wage increase. It goes up $1 a year after that. I don't see someone paying $80 to $120 for my weekly newspaper, and I don't know how we're going to get past or around that. The thing that I worry about is, you know, I have a staff of, between 12 and 14 full and part-time people at any given time, and I want to keep them employed. I want to keep them in the jobs they're in. They're good at what they do, and I don't want to lose them. I don't know how we're going to afford it.
And what do you want to see happen?
You know, I mentioned earlier that we had our best year we've ever had, and we did. It was a 3.4% profit margin last year. We had great revenue in the door. We had a lot of revenue out the door. And, you know, what I want to see happen is a graduated regional approach to the minimum wage increase. It's done. That's not going to happen. That was talked about. It went nowhere.
Gotcha.
You know, if you had a situation where 64 South, you had, you know, a $10 minimum wage or a $10.50 or even $11, and then as you got closer to the Chicagoland area, maybe a larger, you know, minimum wage. I understand that completely, but $15 an hour minimum wage is going to hurt Southern Illinois drastically.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for that. And Gary, promising, I know this is a tough one.
I don't see anything promising. I think the future looks very bleak. I have to be completely honest about it. I'm not part of the news media right now, so I can be honest about it. I just don't see a whole bunch of benefactors surfacing who are going to buy newspapers at high prices and turn them into great websites and continuing print publications and be willing to take not a profit. I just don't see that happening. I think what can happen is charging more for circulation. It makes me sweat even thinking about paying more than I'm paying now. But people need to value news. And if they want it bad enough and they want it quality, I think they will pay for it. So there's going to have to be more reliance on circulation, and newspapers need to be creative about developing revenue streams. I don't know that a lot of papers would have escape rooms, but maybe down here they'd have a car lot next door or something, or a coffee shop. But creativity could help, but I think doing things the way they've always been done, that's going to be just a disaster.
Creativity could help is the line of the night. Mary, I'm going to let you close out.
Well, I work for public radio, and I'm happy to report that we're doing just great. It's not easy, but we're doing okay. And I think the reason for that is because we really work all of the public radio stations work very hard in their communities. We have subscribers, we have donors. In St. Louis, for example, we have just a wide variety of people who are participating in helping to keep us on the air. We don't have a newspaper, so we don't have the overhead of a newspaper. However, we do have a very robust website. And I think what I'm seeing around the country are public radio stations merging with and partnering with, as you pointed out, I think partnerships really is a key for the future, partnering with news operations and perhaps producing digital websites. I know if you want to look at a situation, look at Denver, because Colorado Public Broadcasting has just merged with a couple of small nonprofit digital media sites. Also look at Salt Lake City. The Salt Lake Tribune has just decided that it's going to go nonprofit. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to work everywhere. You mentioned Warren Buffett earlier. Well, Warren Buffett, I believe, bought the Wichita Eagle, and I think has just asked Lee Enterprises to handle its business operations. So I really believe there's a future for news. I used to teach journalism at SIU Edwardsville, and what I would tell my students, similar to what you tell your students, you have to know how to do everything. You're not going to be proficient at all of it, but learn as much as you can and really be good at parts of it. There is always going to be a need for news. And I think people in this nation are going to come back and value it, maybe perhaps more than they do sometimes now. But there are a lot of people who value what we do. And I think I don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years. But I know that being a good reporter, being a good interviewer, doing research, digging into community stories that are important to our communities, that to me is the hope. So I leave it with that.
Not to be a wet blanket, but you mentioned you do mention that it's not going to work everywhere, these partnerships, and you mentioned some markets that are growing and thriving and quite wealthy. This is not the case in Southern Illinois. Our people are leaving. Statewide they're leaving, especially from downstate, and I think the future is going to depend on someone who comes up with a way of making money off news.
Well, on that note, do the other people in the audience have thoughts just on this question? I'd love to hear, or comments or questions as well. Yes?
I think what we touched on earlier about the hyperlocal and what I've always called kind of pay to play in a rural area, we're going to have to focus more on that. So, for example, not really getting the news piece paid for in a roundabout way by charging you to print your wedding engagement photo and story or your obituary, which all those things here used to be free forever, eons, since there was print, and now, I know grandparents and parents they get the paper for the obituaries. There's a reason like that, they get the paper because that's the way they've always done it. But then submitting those things too, which used to always be free, which now those things cost.
Right.
So, back to what Jeff mentioned about the special editions. We just put an ad in there. Our daughter graduated from 8th grade. We put a congratulations ad in there, for her.
Thank you for the ad.
It didn't cost a lot of money, but it was a neat way. And, it was kind of, we have a 20-something and 2 teenagers. Do the teenagers ever, sit down and read a newspaper? Never. No. But they do go look in there for their softball game pictures, the graduation section, the honor roll list. So there are things that are tying them, even though they're not of the generation that's going to read newspaper, for those hyper-local pieces by being there in the community and being visual.
And you're saying, too, that at least in that instance, a willingness to maybe share some, pay more or pay a little bit if it's worth it to you.
Pay something other than, a subscription or, other ways to...
We'll take donations. We're not proud.
That's helpful. Other folks, yeah. And then okay, after that.
So as a TV station, we are still advertisers for it. Because we still have the reach and are able to sustain our business in that way. And I think Mike, Larry, and I are very aware of the need to support professional journalism in Southern Illinois. And as you have pointed out, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to recruit Kim to come down to Southern Illinois.
I do have a reporter opening.
I like it here.
That is the challenge, right? How do we pay Kim what she needs to make in order to come down to Southern Illinois? So I can tell you that in terms of partnerships, that an advertiser-supported television station is willing to be creative and come up with those partnerships. I mean, I'd love to figure out what is the way that we can support each other to help. How do I get more professional journalists funded in Southern Illinois? Not just in Mike's newsroom, but in your newsroom. You know, what is a way that I can support you and you can support the great content for me too?
Well, and I'll speak to that. You know, we have had a very good working relationship with Channel 3. We've shared things with them. You guys have been good enough to share things with us. And quite frankly, I view us as a chain link fence. You know, just one link, we're not that strong, but when you put us all together and we can all work together, it really does shore us up.
So, you know, what I've gathered from this is that I like to be purposeful about it and figure out, you know, and say, we do want more professional journalists in Southern Illinois. So let's put together a group to say, we want to do that. Let's figure out a way of trying to build that chain link fence and make it more solid. So
I think you need to work with Gary too in Carbondale. Carbondale.
So yeah, well, obviously we're tight. You know, so allow us to sign up and be part of that.
I will say the Southern Illinois Editorial Association, which Mike has come to some of the meetings and worked with us some on, we would welcome, you know, that for people to come and talk and maybe even, you know, in some ways reorganize into something like that where we can share content and work together.
I had a kind of response to that.
How much do we pay? Is that
I was going to ask her what she needed.
No, I'm none of this is prescriptive. I'm just kind of putting it out there. If people haven't heard of it before, one thing that the Chicago Sun-Times is using this, and much smaller papers are using it, is Report for America, which is a new initiative. It's kind of like AmeriCorps or Teach for America. If you're familiar with those, they take, you know, really ambitious, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young professionals who haven't been ground down by life or the industry they're entering, and they're put in newsrooms, and their salary is subsidized partially by the by the organization, and then they have at least a 2-year term at this outlet, you know, radio, print, television, whatever it may be, and then there's usually, if everything goes well, there's an option for the organization to then pick up that reporter full time and then take over their salary. Something that City Bureau does is we have a fellowship program. We pay a stipend, so we're trying to develop people who, you know, they can't make the jump yet to doing journalism full time, but they are getting paid for their work. That, I realize, is a really difficult thing, especially in communities that already are struggling to pay the professionals they have. So that, you know, might not be as useful of a solution. One thing that the editor of the Chicago Defender, which is a smaller, very old investigative outlet that's that covers the city, told me about, that as a freelancer, I hated it, but I think he might be onto something, is he was saying, instead of paying, you know, whatever the going rate may be for, 1,800 word investigation, what if I give you health care and you get kind of an honorarium for your work, but we have a collective, almost like you can do the Freelancers Union, which is something that's based out of New York. There's a lot of talk now that so many reporters are now working as independent contractors. They can't, there isn't enough money in newsrooms to support them as full-time staffers, so you've got a lot of hired guns. You can form, that's what City Bureau did. I mean, they formed a small group, to buy health insurance and things like that. And that takes a huge expense off. And then, City Bureau does that with me. I'm technically a part-time staffer with them. They pay my health insurance and benefits. I do get an honorarium for my work, but it's up to me to then, hustle and make the rest of my income through just regular freelance assignments. But having the healthcare and the, dental and vision and life insurance off the table is a huge thing. It's a big stability thing. So you guys are offering that? Okay. That sounds pretty good. It is. I think it's going to be thinking creatively, again, not prescriptive. Because if I were a young reporter, I would feel very hard about someone, telling me, guess what? You're going to have to piece together your income and the stability that your mom or even your older brother had is a pipe dream. That's not going to be true everywhere, but for the places that can't, give a $75,000 starting salary like the Washington Post to live in Washington, D.C., thinking creatively is a way to support those professionals and also serve the community, we hope.
Awesome. Kay, I wanted to get you in.
I've subscribed to the Southern Illinois for over 40 years, and in my opinion, I think there's been some fabulous reporting in the last couple of years. Gabriel Newman-Strait came from being a reporter in Chicago for the Mexican newspaper. He's bilingual. He's done some great investigative reporting. I don't think they're hopeless yet at all. A lot of it did skip through, but they still will go to get regional, local news. Something that really bothered me that went on here was someone saying there is no fake news, there's only opinions. No. There are opinions based on facts and there are opinions based on lies. There still are lies. And we depend on you journalists to get to the truth. Research should be your job. And I worry, I have 4 children between the ages of 26 and 38, none of them get a paper. I worry that the credibility gap is so large that everyone thinks now everything is fake. You can't believe anything. Why read that? It's fake online, it's fake on paper. I think that's the main problem. And that happens, you've got a Fox News is a mouthpiece for our president. This is serious. This is real serious stuff that we need your newspapers desperately. And we need to be able to know that when we read the newspaper, we're not just reading rehashes of somebody's lives, that we all got to the truth.
Be sure to ask your kids to subscribe to a paper. So we need all the help we can get. I do want to mention one thing real quick, and I know we're probably running over time. We had a situation just last week where I guess, columnist / reporter, whatever you want to call him, from Time Magazine put out a tweet of something that Donald Trump said. The only problem was he didn't say it. And he has since apologized for it, pulled it down. But that feeds into that fake news narrative that is out there because it makes us all look bad when that does happen. And, I'm the first one, like you said, with the bad cops. We're not anti-cop, we're anti-bad cop. And I talk to the cops a lot about breaking down that blue wall and policing themselves. We have to do that in our industry as well because we all know that kind of thing does happen. We have to call it out when we see it.
Let me chime in on the fake news. So I've been at this 30 years. The fake news came about with the election of the president. So no matter where you stand,
The term did, but we were receiving that anytime we'd run a story about somebody that they didn't like it, they said we made it up.
Yeah, we made it up, but the whole term was after the election, and no matter where you stand on where it is, that's where it came about. And I have to hear about it all the time, no matter what type of story that we air. If you're in a conservative bent or if you're a liberal bent, it's like, oh, it's fake news. It's like, no, it's news, and when you have leader of the country calling it what it is, I think that's really where this whole issue began. And naturally, I think in one way, for those of us who try to do legitimate news, it pushes us to do a much better job of sourcing it. But when you're up against the leader of your country, saying it every time he opens his mouth doesn't help the situation.
I will say, I'm sorry, I will say this, and Mike knows me well enough to know this. I do lean very conservative, and it is a real problem for me with the president attacking my industry in the way that he does, because we're not all fake news. And when you have him say down at the Carbondale airport, and he points at the bank of news cameras and basically calls us all out as being fake news, that's a very bad thing for our society. Our republic is in trouble.
I'm there providing him coverage, providing that he
Oh well, he wouldn't allow me in. Yeah, he wouldn't. We were barred from the event. We're 8 miles from the airport. So what's that?
You weren't one of the real.
Exactly. So
One thing we didn't touch on that I thought we would is more of this, which I've seen change really the business industry, crowdsourcing and news of the people and that kind of thing, and how that could be managed or harnessed or.
What do you mean by news of the people?
I'm just going to be mindful of time because we're over time. So I just want people to be able to head out if they need to head out, and then if people want to stay and talk more, I think we totally should. But we're after 8, so I'm just going to stop us now, and then hopefully people keep talking. And I just want to take a moment and thank these panelists, Kim and Gary and Jeff and Mary, for their great participation. Thank you.